This is being narrated and streamed live Sunday, March 26th. My narration stutters, stammers, or whatever else will be left in, even in the VOD. And patrons and channel members get advanced notification of the live stream dates and times. Previously on Brick and Mortar, we saw the frustrating, preventable, and saddening losses for various reasons of the Faro, the Emmy Rose, and Stretch Ducks. Today's stream will be a follow-up to all three topics. We'll kick things off with the NTSB's final conclusions on the Emmy Rose, then take a look at a duck-related update from the NTSB, which may have quite the impact on U.S. duck tour operators. Then finally, we'll get into the Faro recommendations from the Coast Guard and NTSB, which are quite extensive, as you could imagine. I do want to get into the Jones Act and the role it plays in the culture surrounding the supply chain in that area of the Atlantic, but we'll be saving that for a separate video. The long-winded Faro recommendations today on their own will be for the truly die-hard brick-and-mortar followers out there. A smattering of safety lessons learned, by far the most substantial portion in today's video. We won't be expanding on all of them because simply just getting through them all is going to be a significant amount of time listening to me ramble. In Suddenly Submerged, The Loss of Emmy Rose, we covered the sinking in detail, and even at that time, authorities had enough to go on to make preliminary recommendations, but they hadn't yet announced their final decision on the probable cause of the sinking, only their initial findings and suspected culprits. It was right around the time I published the video that the NTSB released the final update and closing statements. We'll cover the brief summary and probable cause in the NTSB's own words. On November 17, 2020, after departing Portland, Maine, the 4 crew members aboard the 82-foot-long commercial vessel Emmy Rose fished for 5 days in the Gulf of Maine. On November 22nd, the captain notified a seafood distribution facility in Gloucester, Massachusetts, that they had about 45,000 pounds of assorted fish to offload and expected to arrive at 6 a.m. the following morning. The crew fished for another 4 hours, departing about 6:30 p.m. for Gloucester. At 1:29 a.m. on November 23rd, the U.S. Coast Guard in Boston, Massachusetts, received a distress signal from the Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, or EPIRB, registered to the Emmy Rose. There were no distress calls from the vessel before the EPIRB signal. The vessel had traveled about 45 miles to the west, over the 7 hours since departing the fishing grounds. Weather conditions recorded by a nearby buoy, about 21 miles from the sinking site at the time of the EPIRB signal, were winds from the east-southeast at 17 knots, gusting to 21 knots, and the sea state was 5.6 feet, observed with an easterly swell of 5 to 6 feet. Coast Guard search and rescue assets were deployed to the area of the EPIRB signal, about 27 miles from Provincetown, Massachusetts. Search and rescue efforts continued for 38 hours and covered over 2,200 square miles. During the search, Coast Guard personnel recovered the EPIRB, the life raft, 1 life ring, and 2 wooden fish hold hatch covers from the Emmy Rose. None of the crew members were located as of the date of this report, and they are presumed dead. The vessel sank in 794 feet of water and was not recovered. What we found. We determined that the probable cause of the sinking of the fishing vessel Emmy Rose was a sudden loss of stability, capsizing, caused by water collecting on the aft deck, and subsequent flooding through deck hatches, which were not watertight or weathertight because they had covers that did not have securing mechanisms, contrary to the vessel's stability instructions and commercial fishing vessel regulations. So essentially, this reiterates what we expanded on in the Emmy Rose video back in September of 22. One of the primary areas the NTSB was suspicious of was the lazarette, a small compartment in the stern of these style of vessels that contains the steering moving parts. It holds more than one vulnerability in that the rudder mechanism itself might not be sealed completely against the bottom hull, and of course, as mentioned, the lazarette hatch on the weather deck must be kept closed and watertight, as there is constant flow near and over this hatch for various different reasons. It's an area that's been a culprit in so many floodings and sinkings over the years. Investigators sometimes pointing out that crews find it, quote, hard to access, and/or oftentimes being flooded without notice, as the high bilge alarms inside were faulty. These alarms are an extra line of defense that sound in the wheelhouse, giving crews those additional precious seconds to either perform damage control or prepare to abandon. Moving on to the DUKW updates. In the ongoing duct saga that some brick-and-mortar diehards may have noticed, the lore for these videos has also now taken place off-screen as well, as my discussions with Boston Duck Tours and research in addition to Stretch Duck 7 and 34 yielded some interesting, if conflicting, results about the culture that surrounds these tourist vessels. It's a prime example of always keeping an open mind, critical thinking, and keeping in the front of our minds that generalizations rarely play a role in getting to the heart of lessons that can be learned. So this update came as a surprise to me when it probably shouldn't have. But when I immerse myself in certain projects, I kind of have to ignore most everything else related. It's why you don't see a lot of up-to-the-minute or breaking news releases on this channel much. It tends to be more of a measured approach. My skill set really gives me the most confidence toward the in-depth case studies, so keep in mind I do appreciate all the input in the comments, the updates and the suggestions, since I read all of them. These tend to keep me apprised when I'm buried in research for specific projects. This update from the NTSB, though, regarding legislation that passed in Congress recently, well, I'll just read it, as it's quite self-explanatory for those who have followed the duck drama, as it were. NTSB Chair welcomes maritime safety improvements. Washington, D.C., Washington, December 23, 2022. National Transportation Safety Board Chair Jennifer Homendy welcomed maritime safety improvements in the James M. Inhofe National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023, which the President signed into law today. The legislation advances NTSB recommendations for amphibious vessels known as duck boats and requires the U.S. Coast Guard to provide an initial response to new NTSB recommendations within 90 days. So, prior to the warm season for many U.S. duck boat operators. We applaud lawmakers for their bold action to improve DUKW boat safety, something the NTSB has been concerned about for more than 20 years. But it shouldn't take an act of Congress to address known safety issues for any vessel, and it certainly shouldn't take decades. Duck boats, also known as DUKW boats, were designed and built in the 1940s for military use during World War II. Some were later converted for commercial service. They are unique vessels with special challenges that must be addressed to ensure passenger safety. They require greater reserve buoyancy, canopy removal, and other modifications before waterborne operations and training for crews. The NTSB first identified these safety issues in 1999 with the sinking of the Miss Majestic in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where 13 lives were lost, and recommended corrective actions. They were not acted on, and again, the NTSB made recommendations following the 2018 sinking of the Stretch Duck 7 in Branson, where another 17 lives were needlessly lost. The Act mandates that the U.S. Coast Guard initiate rulemaking within 6 months, requiring reserve buoyancy through passive means and watertight compartmentalization, identification of limiting water environment conditions, such as weather, in which DUKWs may safely operate, proceeding to harbor in case of wind warning, maintaining and monitoring weather radio, informing passengers not to wear seatbelts in the water, performing visible seatbelt checks and maintaining a log recording actions, and annual training for operators and crew. The legislation includes an interim requirement within 180 days to require removal of canopies and window coverings, require passengers wear life vests, re-engineer vessels to minimize hull penetrations, and require bilge pumps and LED lighting. The legislation also brings the U.S. Coast Guard in line with Department of Transportation agencies, which are required to respond to new NTSB recommendations with 90 days. The reporting requirement increases transparency and ensures accountability on NTSB safety recommendations by the U.S. Coast Guard, which, as the marine industry regulator, is best positioned to improve safety. The focus here, of course, being reserve buoyancy and canopies, and while it was refreshing to see Boston Duck Tours take, giving the canopies the ability to slide open in the stern and down the center line, my guess is this likely won't appease the new statutes being put in place. When it comes to the Faro, the lessons learned here are staggering. Before we get into the NTSB's recommendations, there are a couple details I'd like to clarify from my own perspective. First thing I'd like to clear up, the captain's call to a call center. The fact this terrible call center he spoke to treated him like any normal customer or whatever, transferring him back and forth, putting him on hold, as frustrating as it was to hear, the call center's actions, or lack thereof, are almost completely irrelevant. Verified by the evidence and according to authorities, there are numerous steps that could and should have been taken to first avoid the situation, then muster properly, and then actually contact emergency services, the way rescue authorities recommend. Actions the captain actively avoided, instead call TOTE's onshore support line towards the end, a call center that authorities found to not be trained or prepared for calls regarding heavy weather scenarios, fire at sea, or vessel grounding. In this situation, there were so many other methods available to have contacted authorities, but with the captain's indifference to the seriousness of the situation at hand, the vessel was well beyond just damage control, deep inside a strengthening hurricane, and in a status that was nothing short of a total emergency with the need to abandon. It was presumed to be his reasoning for this call to get a qualified individual on the line for what would likely be non-emergency damage control. Could or should the call center have said, "Sure, Captain, let me contact the Coast Guard for you," or, "Hey, Captain, please radio the Coast Guard immediately if this is an emergency"? I mean, maybe. But what would be the precedent for such things when a captain's expected to be fully trained in these situations anyhow? And of course, important to note also, I'm rambling here a little bit, but important to note also is that the life-saving equipment was nearly useless anyway, speaking to the dismal condition this vessel was kept in overall, something we will cover later in the recommendations. But this was similar to the call made to onshore support personnel, quote-unquote, in the Ocean Rangers case, rather nonchalant sounding, indifferent to the situation, and keeping it, quote, within the company, so to speak, instead of just contacting rescue authorities directly, a sort of keep it within the family culture that, in my view, was and quite possibly still is far too prevalent in many maritime industries. Oil platforms take this to the next level due to all their support craft that tend to be physically nearby, but even just normal shipping companies do the same thing with no physical help for hundreds of miles. Add to all this the Coast Guard search and rescue efforts being panned for their response to the Faro's emergency near the eye of a Category 4 hurricane, a response based on the captain's relayed voicemail. I'd like to shed further light on this as well. The captain had attempted to contact his DP, or designated person ashore, a towed employee assigned to the Ponce fleet. The captain didn't talk directly with him at first and instead left a voicemail which this rep soon called in and either described in detail or played directly for Coast Guard Sector Jacksonville. The voicemail as follows.
Cam Davidson, Thursday morning, 0700. We have a navigational incident. I'll keep it short. a scuttle popped open on T-deck, and we were having some free communication of water go down the three holes. Got a pretty good list. I want to just touch it, contact you verbally here. Everybody's safe, but I want to talk to you.
This voicemail very clearly states, everybody's safe, and reinforces the reports of the captain's indifference to the now deadly situation. Thus, the relayed message very clearly gave the impression there wasn't an emergency. I mean, if you hear a captain of this status describe the situation in this way, what are you supposed to think when prioritizing where you'll send your not infinite amount of rescue assets? Assets in huge demand as the storm ravaged thousands of square miles for days on end. Even if the captain had gotten the chance to have his talk with either the designated person ashore or qualified individual at the corporate offices, they were only 40 minutes from sinking and well past the point of damage control or recovery. For example, around 6:55 a.m., just before the voicemail to the designated person, the AB asked the captain how long they'd be in the storm. The captain replied, "Should get better all the time. Right now we're on the back side of it." In addition, at this juncture, based on the El Faro's position and hurricane strength, steadily reaching Category 4, even when the Coast Guard did begin to deploy, they couldn't get within 100 miles of the search and rescue area until 2 days later, when the storm began to subside. A clip from a search and rescue pilot recounting an October 3rd attempt.
My name is Lieutenant Burden, Coast Guard pilot that just finished flying into Hurricane Joaquin, searching for the vessel El Faro. Our search took us within 50 nautical miles of the eye of the storm. At 1,000 feet, the winds were in excess of 100 knots. Visibility was less than 1/4 mile. Cloud ceilings were at 1,000 feet, and the wave height was in excess of 40 feet. Turbulence was moderate, causing the aircraft to climb and descend around 150 feet with airspeed deviations of 20 knots. This was the most challenging weather conditions anyone on our crew had ever flown in.
And when they did try prior to this with the Coast Guard C-130, reports state it immediately suffered damage that caused a fuel leak and had to turn back. This is of course just referring to the Coast Guard search and rescue mission, not to be confused with the inspection, vessel history, and major conversion considerations that investigators found to be lacking on both the Coast Guard and TOT's behalf, lining up those holes in the Swiss cheese model early on, which we will cover in the recommendations. And as always, links to all sources and references are in description. The U.S. Coast Guard safety recommendations can be found in my linked documents, but per my typical routine, and for reasons I won't go into for now, if and when the NTSB also completes a thorough investigation, theirs is the primary source for my presentation. It is of course backed up closely and cross-referenced thoroughly behind the scenes with the Coast Guard's reports, but just a little insight into my process for an incident as impactful as the El Faro. The NTSB's primary findings as to how the El Faro disaster occurred is presented in a quick overview summary they refer to as the probable cause section. To summarize, the National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the sinking of El Faro and the subsequent loss of life was the captain's insufficient action to avoid Hurricane Joaquin, his failure to use the most current weather information, and his late decision to muster the crew. Contributing to the sinking was ineffective bridge resource management on board El Faro, which included the captain's failure to adequately consider officers' suggestions. Also contributing to the sinking was the inadequacy of both TOT's oversight and its safety management system. Further contributing factors were flooding in a cargo hold from an undetected open watertight scuttle and damaged seawater piping. Loss of propulsion due to low lube oil pressure to the main engine resulting from a sustained list, and subsequent downflooding through unsecured ventilation closures to the cargo holds. Also contributing to the loss of the vessel was the lack of an approved damage control plan that would have assisted the crew in recognizing the severity of the vessel's condition and in responding to the emergency. Contributing to the loss of life was the lack of appropriate survival craft for the conditions. I'll be referring to the International Maritime Organization as the IMO throughout this reading, so Based on these thorough investigations, a process that lasted from October 1st, 2015, the date of the sinking, until December 12th, 2017, the date of this report's publication, the NTSB issued the following recommendations. To the U.S. Coast Guard, revise regulations to increase the minimum required propulsion and critical athwartships machinery angles of inclination. Concurrently, requirements for lifeboat launching angles should be increased above new machinery angles to provide a margin of safety for abandoning ship after machinery failure. The NTSB recommends the U.S. Coast Guard propose to the IMO that they require design maximum operating angles of inclination for main propulsion and other critical machinery be included in damage control documents, stability instruments, and booklets, and in the safety management systems for all applicable vessels. Require that all watertight access doors and access hatch covers normally closed at sea be provided with open-close indicators, both on the bridge and locally. Require that on new and existing vessels, seawater supply piping below the waterline in all cargo holds be protected from impact. Require that new and existing cargo vessels be equipped and/or retrofitted with bilge high-level alarms in all cargo holds that send audible and visible indication to a manned location. Require that any opening which must normally be kept open for the effective operation of the ship must also be considered a downflooding point, both in intact and damage stability regulations and in load line regulations under the International Convention on Load Lines. Propose to the IMO that existing cargo vessels operating under the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea be required to have damage control plans and booklets on board that meet current standards. Publish policy guidance to approved maritime training schools offering bridge resource management courses to promote a cohesive team environment and improve the decision-making process, and specifically include navigational and storm avoidance scenarios. Require recurring bridge resource management training for all deck officers when renewing their credentials. Require that all deck officers at both operational and management levels take a Coast Guard-approved advanced meteorology course to close the gap for mariners initially credentialed before 1998. Publish policy guidance to approve maritime training schools offering management-level training in advanced meteorology or in an appropriate course to ensure that the curriculum includes the following topics: characteristics of weather systems including tropical revolving storms, advanced meteorological concepts, importance of sending weather observations, ship maneuvering using advanced simulators in heavy weather preparations, use of technology to transmit and receive weather forecasts, such as navigational telex or weather routing providers, ship routing services, capabilities and limitations, and launching of lifeboats and life rafts in heavy weather. Require that vessels in ocean service 500 gross tons or more be equipped with properly operating meteorological instruments, including functioning barometers, barographs, and anemometers. Revise Title 46 Code of Federal Regulations 170.110, the stability booklet to require 1. Stability instructions, guidance, and data on wind velocity used to calculate weather criteria. 2. List of closures that must be made to prevent unintentional flooding. 3. List of closures that must be made for an opening not to be considered a downflooding point. 4. Riding arm curve, metacentric height table to note the angle at which initial downflooding occurs. Also, add a wind heel table for vessel full load displacement or the condition of greatest vulnerability to wind heel. Update the guidance in Navigation and Inspection Circular 4-77, shifting weights or counterflooding during emergency situations, based on the circumstances of the Faro accident to include a warning that actions by ship personnel intended to correct a list can produce dangerous results if roll-on, roll-off cargo is already adrift inside the vessel, and water has reduced the coefficients of friction for lashed cargo. Review and implement training of Coast Guard inspectors and accredited classification society surveyors to ensure that they are properly qualified and supported to perform effective, accurate, and transparent vessel inspections, meeting all statutory and regulatory requirements. Review and revise the policy for major conversion determinations to consider load line maximum draft as a principal vessel dimension. at regular intervals not to exceed 20 years. Review all life-saving appliances on inspected vessels that are required by Title 46 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 199, and require compliance with current standards. Require that open lifeboats on all U.S. inspected vessels be replaced with enclosed lifeboats that meet current regulatory standards and free-fall lifeboats where practicable. To prevent future errors in converting position data such as that which occurred in the Faro accident, work with manufacturers of global maritime distress and safety system equipment, communication providers, and land earth stations to remove ambiguity from the Inmarsat-C distress alert position reports. Require that all personnel employed on vessels in coastal, Great Lakes, and ocean service be provided with a personal locator beacon to enhance their chances of survival. Modify guidance and training for marine inspectors to ensure that Voyage Data Recorder annual performance tests include the replacement of locator beacons prior to expiration, and that audio used to evaluate quality is recorded while a ship is underway using its main propulsion unit. Propose to the IMO to amend Resolution MSC.333 to specify that normal operations are defined as when a ship is underway using its main propulsion unit, and to assess voyage data recorder problems, including not capturing both sides of internal phone calls on the bridge electric telephone and unrecorded very high frequency communications, and identify steps to remedy them. If the actions recommended to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Safety Recommendation M-17-52 establish that the Automatic Identification System, AIS, is a viable means by which to relay, with acceptable time delay, meteorological and oceanographic data and metadata from vessels at sea for use by global meteorological authorities, propose to the IMO that vessels required to use AIS also be equipped with meteorological and oceanographic sensors, including, at a minimum, sensors for barometric pressure and sea surface temperature that will automatically disseminate the data at high temporal resolution via AIS. Propose to the IMO that vessels under regulations of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea that are not already automatically disseminating meteorological and oceanographic data by other means be required to manually disseminate such data while at sea via the Automatic Identification System or the Voluntary Observing Ship Program at the times of midnight, 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m. UTC or Coordinated Universal Time. To the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Coordinate with the National Weather Service, vessel operators, Automatic Identification System, AIS service providers, and required onboard technology vendors to perform a proof of concept project to establish whether AIS or another suitable alternative can practically deliver in a single message 1. Meteorological and oceanographic data obtained directly from automated instrumentation and manual observation on board vessels at sea. 2. Vessel position and time of observation. And 3. Other important metadata by satellite and land-based receivers to global meteorological authorities via the global telecommunication system with acceptable time delay. To the International Association of Classification Societies. Recommend to your members to increase the minimum required propulsion and critical athwartship's machinery angles of inclination. Concurrently, requirements for lifeboat launching angles should be increased above new machinery angles to provide a margin of safety for abandoning ship after machinery failure. Require that design maximum operating angles of inclination for main propulsion and other critical machinery be included in damage control documents, stability instruments, and booklets, and in the safety management systems for all applicable vessels. Require that all watertight access doors and access hatch covers, normally closed at sea, be provided with open-close indicators both on the bridge and locally. Require that on new and existing vessels, seawater supply piping below the waterline in all cargo holds be protected from impact. Require that new and existing cargo vessels be equipped with bilge high-level alarms in all cargo holds that send audible and visible indication to a manned location. That any opening that must normally be kept open for the effective operation of the ship must also be considered a downflooding point, both in intact and damage stability regulations, and in load line regulations under the International Convention on Load Lines. That existing cargo vessels be required to have damage control plans and booklets on board that meet current standards. Require that damage control plans and booklets required by the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea be class approved. To the American Bureau of Shipping, enhance training of your surveyors to ensure that they are properly qualified and supported to perform effective, accurate, and transparent vessel surveys, meeting all statutory and regulatory requirements. To Tote Services Incorporated, establish standard operating procedures for heavy weather that address operational limitations and oil levels in critical machinery to ensure their continued operation. Establish procedures for opening, closing, and logging all closures that make up a vessel's watertight envelope while the vessel is at sea. Ensure that damage control plans and booklets are aboard all your load-lined vessels, and that officers and crew members are trained in their use. Require senior officers to receive formal training approved by the manufacturer in all functions found in installed stability programs, including damage stability modules. Revise your safety management system and bridge resource management programs to contain detailed policies, instructions, procedures, and checklists to mitigate the risks of severe weather to your vessels. Conduct an external audit, independent of your organization or class society, of your entire safety management system to ensure compliance with the International Safety Management Code and to correct noted deficiencies. Require your vessels to be equipped with properly operating meteorological instruments, including functioning barometers, barographs, and anemometers. Institute a formal company process to provide independent weather routing, passage planning assistance, and vessel position monitoring. Provide formal and recurrent training to your deck officers on the public and commercial weather information systems provided on board each vessel to ensure that the officers are fully knowledgeable about all weather information sources at their disposal, and understand the time delays in the information provided. Provide shoreside management and vessel senior personnel with training in the Rapid Response Damage Assessment Program and standard operating procedures, to include requirements to conduct annual drills and submit departure stability conditions for each vessel on each voyage. According to the NTSB's reports, action taken by Tote since the accident, and keep in mind, I haven't dug into these, they're just from the investigative report dated December 12, 2017. After the sinking, the company introduced a revised approach to risk assessment involving a more quantitative approach that has been incorporated into the EPMV. At the beginning of the 2017 hurricane season, the company sent a reminder to all vessels to review heavy weather procedures, which included a provision for convening a company hurricane advisory team during cyclones. The company has made weather routing services available since the accident, even for vessels on short runs, including between Jacksonville and Puerto Rico. It has replaced the previous emergency call center with one that also provides vessel tracking and weather monitoring support to the company. It has increased the availability of email and internet services on its Marlin and Orca vessels. The company has formalized its Cargo Max training program, instituting regular classes instructed by Herbert Engineering and attended by shoreside personnel and senior deck officers. It has also enhanced its system for tracking crew rest hours and given officers the option to travel the day before they join a ship. It has also upgraded its crew filing and tracking system and is transferring its SMS to an electronic system that will allow access over the internet. The company is contracted with Radio Holland for regular servicing and inspections of bridge equipment on its Marlin vessels and has added a second EPIRB to each vessel. Only one is required. It has installed a camera system for monitoring the terminals in Jacksonville and San Juan and is formalizing and documenting a shoreside procedure for tracking inspection and maintenance records for lashing gear. The company has also produced videos for its Marlin-class ships, including one that illustrates a vessel's general layout and describes the location of safety equipment, escape routes, and emergency equipment. Now, the U.S. Coast Guard published the alleged civil violations brought against Tote in their Marine Board's report, published September 24, 2017. This is a combination of two different styles of Coast Guard reports that I've summarized to make it easier to understand. Evidence of acts subject to civil penalty. 1. Failure to comply with the work rest requirements detailed in 46 U.S.C. Section 8104 and 46 CFR Section 15.1111 for El Faro crew members on multiple dates prior to the accident voyage. On numerous occasions, there were violations for the rest hours prescribed in STCW, or Standards of Work Training, Certification, and Watchkeeping, for deck officers serving on board El Faro. These violations were systemic and not addressed by Tote. In particular, there were 3 violations for rest requirement per 46 U.S.C. Section 8104 for a third mate on July 7, 2015, July 14, 2015, and for a different third mate on September 1, 2015. This rest requirement is for deck officers to get a minimum of 6 hours rest in the 12 hours immediately before the vessel goes to sea. Furthermore, there is evidence that the third mate did not meet the 6 hours of uninterrupted rest on the additional following dates, August 5th, 8th, 22nd, and September 5th, based on the records that were provided by Tote. The complete STCW work records for the accident voyage are not available due to the loss of the El Faro. Number 2, safety orientation. Potential violation of 46 U.S.C. Section 8106 A4. No safety orientation or Coast Guard approved basic safety training for the Polish riding crew. Specifically, a Polish shipwrighter testified that he continued to conduct work on El Faro, i.e., allegedly was not summoned or required to attend during the emergency muster and abandoned ship drills. Number 3, failure to notify the Coast Guard or ABS of repairs to primary life-saving appliances that were conducted on September 28, 2015, just prior to El Faro's departure from Jacksonville on the accident voyage. On July 7, 2015, while at sea, El Yunque effected repairs to a non-operable diesel-powered lifeboat. Number 4, failure to notify the Coast Guard or ABS of repairs to El Faro's main propulsion boiler, superheating piping on August 24, 2015. So the El Faro disaster had the gravity to be a turning point in the industry, and arguments of no more regulations, quote unquote, are another one of the smokescreen type reactions I see in my comments often. And to be clear, I rarely say outright in my videos whether this needs more regulation or that needs less regulation or you need more regulation. So I do find it a bit telling that, despite all this, it's the default knee-jerk reaction when we're dealing with lessons learned and raising awareness on how to make our world safer. So, here's a few of my thoughts on the matter, and we're going to go into my op-ed right now. It might be pretty long. I'm going to take a sip of tea for it, actually. Tea time before the op-ed. So, yet another brick-and-mortar op-ed, as it were. This is going to be rough and ready, off the cuff a bit. I did a poll on the community tab where safety culture, the question was, where does safety culture begin? A few weeks back. And of course, in true internet fashion, many got outright defensive. Several took it the wrong way, in the comments at least. Same old story. But what was surprising, even to me, was just how many did vote you and me. That was one of the options. But the question isn't exactly who should be responsible, it's where does safety culture even begin? I hadn't asked who should be held accountable for your safety in a specific situation, or who actually should enact safety policies. It was simply a holistic approach to say, where does simply caring about safety begin? So to drill down even further, who defines how much you care about safety is the question. And I'm not speaking for that arbitrary organization who would use this as some sort of cynical rhetoric to ensure that safety starts with you. is used against the average worker, so that an employer or whoever that may be can just evade their responsibilities of creating a safer environment. In fact, I'm the guy who was taught workplace safety instruction in an environment where I wasn't coerced. My curriculum was always my own. No one else had a say over it, other than those who provided my certification, which was always through an outside entity, like OSHA, for example. And conversely, I never wanted to be the safety inspector type because I was almost always the boots on the ground worker type, teaching and occasionally coaching on the side. And I didn't hold my classes saying all the cliche feel-good quotes. When I'm asking where does safety culture truly begin, I'm genuinely asking. Hell, I'm even asking myself regularly, not just whoever's listening. I ask myself every day because I also want to hold myself accountable, not only those around me. I find this especially crucial when seeing so much us versus them type culture in the news lately. And so this isn't to say that the groups in the highest ivory towers to the workers in a factory are comprised of individuals that are inherently good or inherently bad. It has been and always will be that what I value most in the world of safety is keeping awareness raised and encouraging cooperation, compassion, and critical thinking. Along with, of course, most importantly, a healthy amount of training and personal responsibility. It does irk me to see when organizations, be it government, employers, corporations, whoever they may be, take the saying like, safety is everyone's responsibility, and pervert their use simply to fit their machinations. This does obstruct the process and obscure the message for sure. Makes people hate seeing it because it just looks overly cynical at that point. But using this in good faith, though, versus using it to dodge lawsuits are two completely different motives altogether. Keep in mind, even when I'm guilty of the us versus them mentality, I have to remind myself constantly, those groups that we tend to generalize and use as scapegoats, the, quote, they aren't some arbitrary blob of people wearing suits out to get us. I mean, those groups are comprised of individuals as well. Not to be confused with the entities that victims' rights attorneys go after when seeking justice and such. That's an entirely different story. I rarely touch on that portion of each story because it's just not in my wheelhouse, so I'm really excited to announce Brick and Mortar's working with someone to make this happen. Anyway, these phrases, safety starts with me, are rooted in the place where concern about safety actually comes from. It has to come from us, you and me. By simply caring about this enough to discuss it means a huge step in a safer direction. Believe me, there are more than enough people out there who don't care about their own safety, let alone the safety of those around them. When I'm standing in front of a class talking about safety, oftentimes in front of people who really don't want to be there, I'm not speaking to some arbitrary, amorphous blob of, quote, them, trying to preach the message. We're having a genuine discussion, an honest back and forth, the individuals and myself, the individuals amongst themselves, the individuals that signed up, from the mechanics on the shop floor to the accountant from the billing department, the director of the engineering department to, on occasion, CEOs, CFOs, and other executive types, and so on. They're all now sitting in the same class, a class being led by the same goofy safety guy who just closed up his Pelican toolbox and had to take 10 minutes just to wash the grease off so he could look halfway presentable in front of everyone. No one in that class is getting some kind of preferential treatment or allowed to belittle others just because of their position. But that's it. It's been awesome hanging out with y'all today, and it's really fun for me. This is really fun. Building it can be a bit stressful, but once I'm in it and hanging out with you guys, it's really cool. Looking at all the chats, hearing what you guys have to say, keeping the discussion going. I love that in the comments of the main features. So, as always, a special thanks to top-tier Patreon supporters: Troy H., Robert G., Philip B., Paul R., P. Rush, Nathan F., Kenneth P., Andrew M., Alex W., and Alex S. And Alex W., you know who you are. I don't know if you want your name associated with you're busy there in the chat, I can see. So all the support has meant so much. Everyone, the chats today, That's why I'm celebrating 1 full year without sponsors. It's because of all you guys. Literally. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. It is because of that. So it's all the support that's keeping the channel going. So we'll close out with safety is up to us, cooperation, compassion, and critical thinking. And don't forget, your safety matters. Stay safe out there, everyone.